Okay, we're live on Zoom.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Lipavetsky, and I'm professor of Slavic at Columbia University. It is my honor and pleasure to open the second panel of the conference dedicated to the centennial jubilee of the philosopher's steamer and the 80th anniversary of the new review, Novyi Zhurnal. So these days where we are all witnessing a weird and tragic repetition of events reminiscent of the events of 1922 of the philosopher's steamer and the emigration caused by the national tragedy. Suddenly, I think, I didn't expect it myself, at least. These events that used to have a historical significance are as relevant as the fresh newspaper. Therefore, everything that we are learning at this conference, everything that we are listening about has a double meaning, how it was back then and how it relates to us today. And I'm very grateful to Marina for organizing this conference and making it all happening. And I'm very, very grateful to all participants of our panel, some of whom are having a very much uncanny hour for the paper presentation due to the geographic location, but Zoom makes miracles. Without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Alex Tudori, professor and academic dean of the St. Vladimir Seminary, professor of church history. He received his theological education in Romania at the Bishop Cassary Seminary, and one of the oldest and most renowned institutions of its kind that survived through the communist period. Alex's research focuses on history of Southeastern Europe from 11th to 15th centuries and on Byzantine history. His main research interest focus is on Byzantine imperial ideology and Byzantine historiography. He works in interdisciplinary philosophy by combining concepts and examples drawn from several disciplines such as history, theology, and social anthropology. And the title of his presentation is the St. Vladimir Seminary through the focus of the academic contribution of Russian emigres. Please, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you to the organizers for inviting St. Vladimir's faculty to present a couple of ideas in this particular conference. I think St. Vladimir's was rightly pointed by the organizer because in terms of Russian immigration here in the United States, St. Vladimir's has a particular role, and it was the institution, the main institution of theological education that responded to the Russian Orthodoxy in North America, or implementation and pushing forward the Russian Orthodoxy in North America in the 20th century. This is a kind of a work in progress because I'm right now working with a colleague of mine, Deacon Vitaly Permiakov. He originally is from Russia, from the Baltic states, but he joined the seminary 2 years ago, and we are working on a full history of the institution. And right now, it's only, I only present a couple of ideas that we were dealing with throughout this long project. Probably will be finished in 2 years from now. We are working with archives of the Orthodox Church in America and also our own archives, St. Vladimir Seminary. I will start with a quotation from 2005 from Father Leonid Kishkovsky, who was invited to give the annual Shmeman lecture at St. Vladimir Seminary. And he's pointing to three particular professors from our faculty throughout the decades. And I will focus on these three. They are pretty famous: George Florovsky, Alexander Schmemann, and John Meindorf. But there is something in common, and this is why I will focus only on them. Obviously, in terms of Russian emigres, there are multiple other names that I'll mention in the end of my presentation. So the quotation starts as follows. Fathers Alexander Schmemann and John Meindorf were among the 20th century's articulate theological witnesses to the living, dynamic tradition of the Church. They saw the liturgical and sacramental life, the theology and history of the Church in the context of the living tradition. They made their contributions to the life and thought of Orthodoxy in a way which did not limit itself to a description of the tradition or a repetition of it. They responded to the tradition, taught and preached in the spirit of the tradition, and tried to relay the lessons of the tradition to the challenges of their time in the world and in the Church. And today we gratefully observe the living continuity between the contemporary scholars at St. Vladimir Seminary and the teaching of Fathers George Florovsky, Alexander Schmemann, and John Meindorf. From an Orthodox perspective, articulated with such perseverance by the American fathers of St. Vladimir's, Florovsky, Schmemann, and Meindorf, tradition should be defined like that. There is no orthodoxy without holy tradition, which implies communion in the spirit and in truth with the testimony of the apostles and fathers, based on the belief that the power of God, and in spite of all human historical weaknesses, there has been and continues to be an uninterrupted, consistent, and continuous holy tradition of the faith preserved by the Church throughout the ages. This belief in tradition is not identical with simple conservatism. The holy tradition is a living tradition. It is a testimony of unchanged truth in a changing world. End of quotation. The most important contribution of St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary and its great theologians for the contemporary Orthodox thought is related to the tradition of the Church. Rediscovered and conceptualized, understood ecclesiologically by Florovsky or eschatologically by Meindorf, employed liturgically by Schmemann, tradition has been revived in the theology of three Russian luminaries at St. Vladimir Seminary in the second half of the 20th century. Encouraged by the theological movement of renewal, ressourcement, that had encompassed at the beginning of the 20th century both Christian East and West, Florovsky, Schmemann, and Meindorf approached the tradition from different perspectives, but complementary and consensual. Tradition is dynamic. It identifies never with traditionalism, nor with isolated traditions, provides the source and criterion of authentic Orthodox theology, but also answers not ad literam, but in its spirit, to the turmoil of man from all times, implicitly from our days. Father Georgy Vasilyevich Florovsky was born in Odessa in 1893. He left Russia in 1920, only to move to Sofia in Bulgaria. In 1921, he moved to Prague, and in 1926, he was invited to join as faculty member the newly established Institute of Orthodox Theology, Saint-Serge, in Paris, where he served between 1926 to 1948. In 1948, he moved to New York to serve as professor for patristics and dean at St. Vladimir Seminary until 1955. Then he moved to Holy Cross and Harvard University between 55 to 64, and Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary between 1973 and 1979. His theological work brings a new orientation and a new fundamental criterion in contemporary Orthodox theology. In the secularized modern world, devoid of authentic moral landmarks, only an authentic theological renewal can bring the rediscovery of the truth of Holy Scripture and of the Holy Tradition. In order to present the gospel as a living reality, Florovsky announced his appeal to go back to the fathers, ad fontes, and he called this vision faithful to the patristic tradition, the neo-patristic synthesis. By returning to the Holy Father, which is the leitmotif of his theological research, Florovsky also insisted on a genuine re-Hellenization of Orthodox Christianity, for a renewal of Christian Hellenism, which had been baptized, transfigured, and incorporated in the reality of the Church as an eternal category of Christian existence. The scripture and the dogmatic definitions of the ecumenical councils have been expressed in the categories of Christianized Hellenism, Tributary for a long time to Western philosophy, Orthodox theology could only find its identity by returning to its patristic sources. Without ignoring the problems of modernity, the valuable heritage of the Byzantine Fathers must be rediscovered, brought back to life for the modern world, for time and present situations. The independence of modern theology must not be achieved via radical isolation of the West. Sorry for the light. Orthodox theology is called to answer the question of non-Orthodox benefiting from the depth of its tradition and to confront the West with the confession of the truth of Eastern Christendom. As prolific as he was, Florovsky was, however, a selective theologian on dogmatic matters. He showed little interest to Trinitarian dogma or pneumatology, but very special attention to Christology and ecclesiology. In his ecumenical labor, he was constantly opposed to relativism, understanding Orthodox involvement in interconfessional dialogue not as a premise for a slow obliteration of one's confessional identity, but as an important missionary opportunity to confess Orthodoxy in the West. Florovsky brought patristic literature back to the attention of his Protestant contemporaries with such a vigor and in a manner never known before him. Father Alexander Shmeman was born in Revel in Estonia in 1921. Father Alexander's family emigrated in Paris, where he attended Saint Serge Institute of Orthodox Theology up to 1945. And in 1951, at the invitation of Father George Florovsky, he moved to St. Vladimir Seminary, where he remained as professor for liturgics and dean until the end of his life in 1983. Through his vast theological work, Shmeman proposes a re-understanding of Eastern worship through its historical and ecclesiological approach. His main concern is rediscovering the authentic meaning of Christian worship, realizing the profound divergence between the spirit and authentic tradition of the Church on the one hand, and our current dogmatic and canonical conscience on the other. Under the influence of Western scholastic theology, Orthodox theology was subjected to a deep systematization that alienated it from both the spirit of Eastern tradition and true experience of the faithful. He thus speaks of an identity crisis of Orthodoxy as a result of the scholastic pseudomorphosis of Orthodox theology, which injected into the Church the poison of a legalist foreign spirit to the Holy Fathers and tradition. Here we find the general lines of theological thought of George Florovsky, his mentor, echoed throughout 20th century Orthodox theology. If Florovsky spoke of a rupture in ecclesial consciousness, an estrangement between theological scholarship and ecclesial experience, Shmeman follows the same perception, but clearly applied in the field of liturgical theology, speaking of the disconnection between theological research and liturgical experience. The deepest trace of the impact of Father Alexander Shmeman theology in North America and the Orthodox world is undoubtedly linked to the divine liturgy and the frequent communion. Shmeman is largely responsible for revitalization, the celebration of the pre-sanctified liturgy, reciting aloud the prayers of the invocation of the Holy Spirit, encouraging the use of English language in the Orthodox worship, but above all, the return to frequent communion of the faithful. The impact of the first Eucharistic manifesto, the Great Lent, can be perceived from the simple statistics of the book sale on the American market. In 1968, this was the first book published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press in collaboration with Athens Printing, with an initial stock of 3,000 copies, sold out in less than 3 weeks. Along with the other two works by Father Alexander, For the Life of the World and Of Water and the Spirit, the Great Lent still opens today after 5 decades, the SVS Press bestsellers book list. Father John Meyendorff was born in France in 1926, was educated at the Sorbonne in the field of philology and Saint Serge Institute of Orthodox Theology, where he graduated in 1948. 1 year after he successfully defended his doctorate in 1959, he joined the faculty of St. Vladimir Seminary, where he served as professor for patristics and church history and dean up to 1992. Father John Meyendorff's theological productivity is impressive in quality and quantity. He was very precise in respect to his statements and meticulous in his research. From all the theologians who follow Florovsky at St. Vladimir Seminary, Father John remained the most devoted to the neo-patristic appeal launched by his mentor, even with regard to Christian Hellenism, the corollary of neo-patristic synthesis. Without excelling in biblical exegesis, Meindorf's theology is deeply grounded in church history and patristics. The Holy Father's writings are the main sources of his theological thought, a special place being reserved to St. Maximus the Confessor and especially St. Gregory Palamas. His perception of history and humanity is profoundly Christocentric. Human nature finds its purpose and fullness only in Christ, who is the pioneer of our salvation. The church is the community of those who live in the person of Christ, and the space in which Christ is revealed in the Holy Sacrament. In ecclesiology, Meindorf's preferred topic was the related characteristics of the church, unity and Catholicity. Source of hundreds of pages dedicated to this topic came from the lack of unity of the American Orthodoxy, from the jurisdictional disorder completely foreign to the esse ecclesiae. The tradition of the church, with its dynamism and evolution along the secular historical factors, has retained his attention directly or implicitly more than any other theological theme. For more than 3 decades, his courses and research interests have focused on Byzantine history. An expert in Byzantine and Slavic epigraphy, Meindorf was interested to discuss a period of the church history in which the church, with its theology, institutions, liturgical and social life, was inseparably from the society as a whole. A synthesis of the great legacy that these 3 giants and their colleagues, Nicholas Losky, George Fedotov, Nicholas Arseniev, Alexander Bokolebov, Serge Verkhovskoy, or Sophie Kolomzin, passed on to the faculty of St. Vladimir Seminary today, would include, first, a permanent call for unity of all the Orthodox jurisdictions in North America, the seminary being constantly described as a laboratory of Orthodox unity in America and a true pan-Orthodox institution. Secondly, a tenacious search for harmony between past and present, because the true tradition is always a living tradition. It changes, and yet it always remains the same. Thirdly, a certain type of community cohesion centered around the chapel and the Orthodox worship, with all its peculiarities as designed up to the smallest details by Father Alexander and Father John. The chapel is a daily meeting place for the whole family of St. Vladimir's, where faculty and students pray and serve together. And finally, organically connected to the history of this institution and the vision of Florovsky, Schmemann, and Meindorf, is the missionary vocation of St. Vladimir Seminary. The history of this institution is that of constant challenges perpetuated endemically, but contested by an uninterrupted consciousness of academic excellence. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much. The timing is absolutely perfect. I was just writing you a chat message, but you finished before I managed to send it. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Lada Panova, and Lada is a visiting researcher at USLA. She is the author of many wonderful books, and her research interests include poetic and literary theory, Russian modernism, avant-garde, and Russian émigré writers, first and foremost, Vladislav Khodasevich, Ivan Bunin, Vladimir Nabokov, and her most recent interest is in the genre of Bildungsroman, and her presentation also relates to subgenre of Bildungsroman. She is going to talk about Künstlerroman, and the title of her paper is, as you can see, as maybe we can see, Born in Exile, celebrating the centennial of the Russian Künstlerroman. Lada, click cancel. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, do you see my presentation?
Perfect.
I'm trying to make a slideshow, but
click cancel here. Click cancel. Cancel. Just cancel here. Okay, right. Okay. And play from start. Right.
Thank you. Literary genres follow the same routine as a living being. So the routine being comprising birth, formative years, a period of bloom, and eventually death. The birth period, the birth metaphor implies that new genres originate from older parental ones, while the death metaphor suggests that when their heyday is over, they are no longer in demand. Tracking down the history of a genre is an intellectually challenging task, as the history of coming-of-age novel or Bildungsroman, outlined by Georg Lukács, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Franco Moretti, clearly demonstrates. My goal, however, is not that far-reaching, and for a reason. The genre I'm going to talk about has not been studied yet. It is the Russian version of Künstlerroman, or coming-of-age novel, dedicated specifically to young artists in the process of maturation. This paper is an attempt to identify this genre by capturing its birth and the first 2 decades of its existence, also sketching out its genealogy and specifying its characteristic features. Yet another important parameter for discussion is the circumstances of the existence. So the Russian émigré Künstlerroman emerged in the first half of 1920s, developed during the interwar period, reached its peak by the Second World War, and then went into decline. My project, if not a biography of the genre, is something like a verification of a citizen's identity, or akin to a Nansen passport issued for refugees in the interwar period. The founding fathers of the Russian Künstlerroman, namely, and here is the list of the whole romans, whole novels, so namely Boris Zaitsev, Vladimir Nabokov, Ivan Shmelev, Ivan Bunin, Alexander Kuprin, and Gaito Gazdanov. So they happened to be those who settled in Paris and Berlin as stateless persons. While in Russia, they had witnessed the advent of the Soviet totalitarian regime. After they managed to flee, they raised their voices against the Bolsheviks. None of them, except for Kuprin, ever went back, despite blandishments from Soviet officials. Perceived in this exilic context, the Russian émigré Künstlerroman reads as a farewell to the Russian gentry and other classes crushed by the Bolsheviks, sometimes even as a nostalgic record of the vanished pre-revolutionary order. Its master plot is meant to capture the birth of an artist from the spirit of Russian gentry's demise. The protagonist embodies traditional Russian values and such universal values as human dignity, individual freedom, and freedom of speech. As a person of integrity, he, or in one case, she, never joins any groups or causes, while identifying himself only with his family. From a very early age, the protagonist takes the risks of his own decisions. Through trial and error, he grows up into a professional artist, writer, singer, painter, chess player, or at least a young bohemian. Paris and Berlin, the 2 cultural capitals of Europe at the time, cosmopolitan as they were, welcomed a civilizational mix and cultural hybridity. The Russian émigré Künstlerroman was born as a crossroads of cultures, ideologies, and literary fashions. Getting no recognition from the official Soviet press, it expanded the family of Western coming-of-age novels. Bunin's Life of Arseniev received the highest possible acknowledgement in the West, and that is, of course, a Nobel Prize for Literature. Nabokov's Gift, now a worldwide bestseller, on the contrary, made a quiet debut. Its serialization was censored and truncated, which is very well known, and that was the price Nabokov had to pay for his decision to write chapter 4 of The Gift, as an unbiased biography of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, then an untouchable idol among revolutionary and liberal circles. A canon. The genre was capacious enough to accommodate various types of artists or to cover different ages of the protagonist and to display different aesthetic and ideological attitudes. To be sure, each of the 10 novels is designed in a unique way. Still, on a deeper level, they all share an exilic agenda, master plot, and an archetypal protagonist, thus forming a canon. To name their two most striking common features, they all exhibit signs of trauma, the irreparable severance from their native land and the destruction of old Russia. And also they ground the story of their hero artist in reflections about Russia's past and present. The reflections are deployed in a meta-artistic or meta-literary mode in full correspondence with the Künstler discourse of the genre. Let me now talk about the relationship between the Russian and the European Künstlerroman. Of course, the European was an older sibling to our version. The European Künstlerroman emerged as an offspring of the Bildungsroman by shifting its narratorial focus from social, moral, educational, psychological, and other everyday issues to art, creativity, and artist's career and psychology. Several classical Bildungsromane had chosen a talented youth as their protagonist. With some exceptions, such a protagonist had an unfulfilled or failed artistic career. Gercy, Balzac, and Flaubert went further to create Bildungskum Künstlerromane. Émile Zola took the next step, leaving this gray area and creating, in the spirit of his signature naturalistic method, the first proper Künstlerroman. So that's the masterpiece on the screen. Characteristically, its title staked out the archetypal area of artistic creativity and thus signaled that the Künstlerroman was born as a separate genre. The modernist epoch, strongly preoccupied with art, media, meta-artistic layers of the text, experiments in content delivery, not to mention the unique personality of an artist, stimulated further development of the Künstlerroman. To name a few major modernist contributions to the genre, I will just say a couple of words about Joyce's A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, because it has another archetypal title. So theoretically speaking, when Russians engaged in the genre of the Künstlerroman, they could more or less, like their European predecessors, reinvent Russian Bildungsprose, by that time already 100 years old, into a narrative about a budding artist. Yet another option was to accept the preeminence of the European Künstlerroman authors. In fact, the Russian Künstlerroman is a happy combination of both options. Being half Russian, half European, resulted in adopting the cutting-edge modernist narrative about the birth of a young artist, but imbuing it with Russia-oriented, sometimes artistically conservative content. The Russian Künstlerroman is like Janus, the two-faced Roman god of beginnings, transitions, and endings. One of the genre's faces, turned to the future, identifies with modernism and its search for new forms. Thus, in The Life of Arseniev, Bunin's realism is enriched with modernist narrative techniques, while Nabokov's Gift, written conceptually rather than factually, brings the Russian Künstlerroman to a new level. It is modernism inside out. As for the second of the Russian Künstler romance phase, the one looking back to the past, it is defined by the above-mentioned traumatic exilic agenda. The Russian émigré Künstler roman distanced itself from Soviet literature and the socialist realism Bildungsroman in particular. This was an essential aspect of its generic identity. The Soviet Bildungsroman was part of mass literature aimed at manipulating the reader's mind. Its primary goal was to create the new Soviet man, not a strong individual like the protagonist of the Russian émigré Künstler roman, but rather a standard cog in a big social mechanism. Since the Latin label coined for the new Soviet man is Homo Sovieticus, the protagonist of the Russian émigré Künstler roman could be called Homo aristocraticus in Plato's broad sense. In socio-economic terms, the Homo aristocraticus master plot of the genre boils down to abandoning a privileged, gentlemanly social position for the lower status of an artist. The reasons may vary from hard times to the demise of the pre-revolutionary hierarchy to a personal choice. At least half of the 10 Russian Künstler characters are autobiographical, replaying the life trajectory of their authors. The Homo aristocraticus self-perception of the authors shared with their protagonists is that they see themselves as the finest product of post-Petrine Russian civilization, moreover, an irreplaceable cultural elite. Since under the Bolsheviks, the Homo aristocraticus type was facing extinction, it was like a threatened species hoping for a rescue. Physical rescue, of course, was of course beyond the means of literature, which made preserving the memory of good Russians the primary goal of the Russian émigré Künstler roman. And the last thing I want to say is that the third decade of the 21st century is the time to celebrate the centennial of the Künstler roman. A festive mood is of course appropriate, but there is still work to be done on this genre. To continue the study of the Russian Künstler roman, we can look for specimens that appeared after the Second World War, either under the influence of the exilic canon or independently in Russia or abroad. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lada. So wonderfully on time. Thank you. I'm now introducing our third speaker, Michael Atherton, Professor Emeritus of Western Sydney University. And Professor Atherton is the Foundation Professor of Music at Western Sydney University. He is considered a leading expert in Australian-made musical instruments and sound-producing objects in Oceania. He is an author of several academic books, as well as in 2017, he published his adaptation and editing of In Exile from St. Petersburg, The Life and Times of Abram Saulovich Kagan, a book publisher told by his son Anatoly Kagan. He is a member of the family circle of the descendants of Abram Kagan, a famous publisher and essayist in pre-revolutionary Russia, and In Exile, a passenger of the philosopher's steamer. And Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I trust everyone can hear me clearly. Thank you for this opportunity to participate. It's an honor. I must begin by saying I do not speak Russian, and I will apologize for my at times clumsy pronunciation and hope that those speakers will accept my humble offering. I'm presenting on behalf of my late father-in-law, Anatol Kagan, who is the son of Abram Zalovich, who is the subject of my talk. Anatol, who enjoyed a career as a leading architect in Australia, helped his father Abram to write his memoir. Anatol, prior to his passing in 2009, entrusted me to reorganize and edit the manuscript. I acknowledge my late mother-in-law, Dawn Kagan, who tirelessly typed the original, waiting patiently for Anatol to translate and dictate the English text. There is a book, a small-run publication, which I produced in Australia, and hoping maybe that we will find or achieve an international publisher fairly soon. I'll just show you the book. Not as a shameless plug, but to want to share what I'm actually doing. With a passport stamped never to return, Abram Solovich was expelled by Lenin in 1922 for his Jewish Menshevik activities and connections. Poets, artists, philosophers, linguists, scientists, and political figures numbered among his many friends and associates as he continued to publish Russian literature, philosophy, and historiography. Following his exile, he transferred his activities to Berlin, where he published both Soviet and Russian émigré literature and remained in the forefront of Russian culture in a foreign land. But with a passport that disallowed return to his homeland, he was expelled from Germany shortly before the war, the Second World War. In 1938, he established himself once again as a publisher in Belgium, but had to flee ahead of the advancing German army. He was interned in Vichy, France, then managed to escape via Casablanca to the United States. Once settled in New York, Abram founded International Universities Press, Incorporated, a company that published books mostly devoted to psychoanalysis. On the Preußen, the ship taking him to exile from St. Petersburg to Stettin in Germany, Abram wrote in someone's autograph book, "I would be happy to return to my homeland under changed conditions." However, he died 2 years before the launching of Perestroika, and thus the oldest of Russian book publishers to survive the revolution remained in exile until his death in 1983. The rest of my talk, I will outline the following: his publishing activities over 3 periods. In the first exile from Russia, the second exile from Germany, and a third period, his activities in the United States. But first, a couple more facts about Abram in St. Petersburg. Prevented by quotas and anti-Jewish discrimination, allowing him into high school, Abram went to Poland to study. He returned home as a 16-year-old and enrolled in Kazan University to study pure mathematics. He said at the time, "I considered myself a social democrat Menshevik, a Bundist." At 18, he transferred to St. Petersburg University, where he was admitted to the law faculty. Significantly, in 1917, Abram set up Nauka i Shkola, which published books of a predominantly philosophical, non-Marxist type. Authors included Nikolai Onofrievich Lossky, Lev Platonovich Kasavin, and Ivan Ivanovich Lapshin. Nauka i Shkola became a center for scientists and social activists who often crowded its huge reception room where they made appointments with each other. There was no respite from offers to have books published. Interestingly, Abram introduced into Russia the psychologist William James, who was hitherto unknown in the country. Lapshin translated James' Principles of Psychology, which was immediately accepted at all institutions of tertiary education and continued to be sold out. While running Nauka i Shkola, Abram joined a cooperative with Yakov Noevich Bloch and Grigory Leonidovich Lozinsky, who in 1920 formed the publishing company Petropolis Press. It focused on literature, philosophy, and history. Among the many poets they published were Anna Akhmatova, Nikolai Gumilev, Osip Mandelstam, Ivanov, Adamovich, and Kuzmin. All books enjoyed great success. Abram soon managed other publishing companies that were left in his care, including the printing establishment of Golika and Wilborg, possibly the best in Europe at the time. It specialized in luxurious multicolored books. For example, Pikovaya Dama, The Queen of Spades by Pushkin, with illustrations by Alexander Benoit. One legacy was also the publishing of an ex libris of Russian artists, and I include that here. Also, an insignia for my late father-in-law, Anatol Tolya-Kagan. Poet Nikolai Gumilev was closely acquainted with Abram. Gumilev actually helped him acquire Apollon, a high-quality art journal. Their friendship is reflected in the gift to Abram of an unpublished poem, Molitva Masterov, Prayer of the Masters, written in Abram's autograph book. Gumilev, as we know, was shot by the Cheka on trumped-up treason charges. Unsurprisingly, Abram was also detained and put in a cell. However, he wasn't tortured before his release after a couple of weeks. This was followed by an order to leave Russia, or as he said to Anatole, to avoid, quote, being put into the waste, unquote. The first exile. On board his ship, exiles Abram and family were joined by Kotyarevsky, Kasavin, Loshki and Lapshin, all connected with Nauki Shkola. Abram was determined to continue what he'd been doing in St. Petersburg. They discussed creating a new company in Berlin and listed books for publication, also agreeing to bring authors from other exiled groups, especially from Moscow, authors such as Nikolai Alexandrovich Bedev and Semyon Lyudvigovich Frank. Here is a photo that I found of Lapshin, 1934. I have quite a collection. There were in this period many more Russian books published in Germany than there were German books. Abram wasted no time in re-establishing Petropolis in Berlin. Displayed are two examples of the publication of poems by Reza Bloch, the daughter of Jakob Neuvich. Petropolis also teamed up with Obelisk Publishing, the latter co-managed by David Yefimovich Kahan, publishing books in philosophy and in religious philosophical literature and metaphysics. Although exiled as a political criminal, Abram's literary connection with Soviet Russia was unbroken. Manuscripts arrived steadily, some even through the Soviet embassy. All writers who arrived in Berlin or were passing through on their way to Paris invariably contacted Abram with manuscripts including those of colleagues. Some even left money in the accounts of Petropolis Press to avoid taking it back to Russia. Here is a photo of Yakov Noevich Bloch, lifelong friend, professor of languages in Berlin in 1930. Abram travelled often because there was a great demand for Russian literature in the countries which previously comprised parts of Russia, like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, as well as in some of the centres of Russian emigration, in Paris, Prague and Yugoslavia, even Italy and Sweden. He went to Prague to set up book distribution, where he published Verva's What to Tell the Children, and books that became a vital resource for the study of popular education in Russia. Abram visited Poland on 2 occasions, an excellent market for Russian books, but he was also interested in Polish literature, having been in high school in Poland. He could, by this stage, read Polish classics, and he went on to publish the successful contemporary Polish poets. From Warsaw, Abram went to Vilnius, Lithuania, where he lived briefly with his close friend Kasavin. Both men were imprisoned in St. Petersburg and shared a cell. Both met up again on the Preußen, the ship that carried them into exile. Kasavin would go to Lithuania and teach himself Lithuanian so expertly that he became one of the country's leading authorities in the language. He was professor of history at Kovno University. On the 27th of February 1933, Petropolis was celebrating its 10th jubilee in a suburban hall in Grunewald, Berlin. Losif Vladimirovich Gessen, Jakub Neuvich and Abram Solovich presided. The 100 or so attendees included writers, journalists, publishers, lawyers, doctors and social activists. Towards the end of the evening, the gathering received the news that the Reichstag was on fire. The Nazi rise to power was now palpable. One day, a young man named Lev Sedov came to Abram's office. He said he knew Abram's son Anatole. Both had been students at the Berlin's Technische Hochschule. Lev Sedov was son of Leon Trotsky. He wanted to publish My Life, his father's autobiography. Abram, who had met Trotsky in St. Petersburg, said he found him, quote, personally abominable, unquote. Although opposed to Trotsky's political activities, Abram felt it was important for Russian history and culture to publish My Life, even if he deemed it to be, quote, a complete panegyric, unquote, of Trotsky, though, quote, excellently written, unquote. Anatol read the proofs, took them to Sadov, who in turn brought them back to Abram. Sadov also helped Abram import Soviet and antiquarian books, which were sometimes very valuable, the sale of which started to offset the cost of publishing books that offered small returns. Abram sold the books to the Berenson Library in Italy and the Morgan Library in New York. The latter also asked to purchase old Russian icons, another source of funds for Petropolis. The second exile. Early in 1938, Abram was ordered to leave Germany, owing to his Russian passport rather than his Jewish connections. With the help of friends, he avoided the wrath of Stalin and secured permanent residence and a work permit in Belgium. He was immediately active in publishing again, connecting with the large Russian colony in Brussels. He engaged the services of a Russian printery and resumed correspondence with authors, including Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov, Vladislav Kodasevich, and Mikhail Osogin. In the beginning of May 1940, German planes began night bombing Brussels. The Kagan family left quickly by car. Shells exploded around them as they headed towards the French border. Later on a train to Paris, the family were often surrounded by gunfire. They could hear bullets whistling past and had to lie on the floor of the carriages. Next, they travelled to Toulouse, where a Jewish committee, the Société des Juifs en France, was assisting refugees. Abram joined the committee branch in Marseille to help the Society's mission by compiling the names of refugees until he and his family could get a passage to the US. But they couldn't go through Spain or Portugal. The family had to first go via Casablanca and wait for a passage to cross the Atlantic. Once in New York, Abram was happy to do labouring work in a zip fastener factory to support his family. Quite a career change for a Russian intellectual of that time. By chance, he met up with George Gurevich, the author of Rousseau and the Declaration of Rights, published way back in St. Petersburg by Petropolis Press. Together, these men published Gurevich's Bill of Rights. It was among Abram's first New York publications. Next came books dealing with concentration camps, such as Ashes and Fire by Jakob Pat, and Gisela Perl's famous I Was a Doctor at Auschwitz. Abram soon discovered that simply republishing books in Russian was not viable in the United States, so he switched to publishing books in English, in particular those focusing on psychoanalytic literature, a field that was emerging fast in the US. He'd already published in Berlin a Russian translation of Carl Jung's Psychological Types. In New York, however, he met Freud's daughter, Anna, and subsequently became a constant publisher of Freudian literature. In 1994, he published the Yearbook of Psychoanalysis, a series of hardcover anthologies. This led to creating an official journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. It was followed by the books Psychological Issues and the Psychological Study of the Child, and 4 volumes of the Minutes of the Vienna Psychological Society, going way back to the beginnings of psychoanalysis. The activities of International University Press, driven by Abram's commitment to support scientific inquiry, encouraged the growth of psychoanalysis in the United States. In conclusion, I hope I've stimulated your interest in the life and work of Abram Solovich Kagan. His name may not appear in many history books, but his endeavours as a publisher of literature, philosophy and science are sufficient justification to put on record his life as a significant contributor to human culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. And
Mark, you're on mute. We did.
Hello.
Sorry. The presentation by Dr. Sofia Manukova, City College of San Francisco, Ayn Rand, and Alexandra Kropotkin in the USA. Please.
Can I share screen now?
Yes, please do share the screen.
Mm-hmm. Esteemed colleagues, I'm going to talk about Ayn Rand and Alexander Kropotkin. This is a comparative study, and this comparative analysis will view the morphology of their character development and their rich contributions to American culture, portraying commonalities and differences mirrored in their publications and ego documents. The reason for selecting these two individuals may not be so obvious, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will see the value of the particular pairing and the intention behind this at first glance seemingly arbitrary juxtaposition. In the light of the current events, which have led to some elements of Russophobia, I believe now more than ever, it's necessary to shine the light on the positive social impact of those whose lives have been shaped by the Russian roots. This academic inquiry will explore the range of individual experiences of these two fully blossomed public figures to trace the impact of the Russian culture on the development of vastly different personalities. Let me give you a short glimpse into their lives. Alisa Zinovyevna Rosenbaum, whose pen name was Ayn Rand, was born in St. Petersburg in 1905 in a well-to-do Jewish family. Nurtured by the Russian culture, she was well-versed in Russian literature and philosophy, which formed and shaped her worldview. Alexander Kropotkin was born in the United Kingdom, Bromley, United Kingdom, in the family of the exiled anarchist revolutionary Peter Kropotkin. And she was brought up in the best traditions of the Russian culture, internalizing the archetype of a Russian woman. This portrait of hers was drawn by Sir Gerald Kelly. Both of them were very early exposed to the Western culture. Ayn Rand, which was her pen name, as I mentioned before, Alisa Rosenberg, went to St. Petersburg University and graduated from it, studying the philosophy of Aristotle and Friedrich Nietzsche, whose teachings defined her world outlook. She also studied at the Leningrad Institute of Cinematography, entertaining a dream of getting to Hollywood and working in Hollywood. She wrote a book about Paula Negri, a Hollywood silent movie star. Alexandra Kropotkin, during her formative years, had been surrounded by her father's friends and followers, such as William Morris, Oscar Wilde, Bernard Shaw, and Somerset Maugham, with whom she had a very short affair. Here is Somerset Maugham, also the portrait by the same artist, Sir Gerald Kelly. While she was among those people who were interested in the Russian culture, and Somerset Maugham, as an MI5 agent, was preparing to go on a spying mission to St. Petersburg on a spying assignment, and was studying Russian language and was getting some skills by associating with Sasha Kropotkin. Both women found themselves living through the most turbulent events and times in Russia. The time of the Civil War, the time of the murder of the Tsar's family, the time of dire poverty. And not only that, what their families experienced was a very heavy blow to them, too personally. The Kropotkin's estate of 250 acres in Tambov province was appropriated by the Bolsheviks. Alexandra's father, Peter Kropotkin, died of starvation in 1921. Ayn Rand's family, which was deprived of all their possessions by the Bolsheviks, had to survive in dire poverty. So both of them conceived an idea of leaving Russia and going to the land of freedom, to the land of jazz, to the land of bootleggers and the Hollywood glory, and also the land and the country where Sergei Rachmaninoff, who moved there in 1918, had been giving concerts in Carnegie Hall. Having Rachmaninoff in mind, who couldn't let go of close ties to his mother country, one can conclude that the process of adaptation to the new country can take complex forms. We can see the zeitgeist that by the arrow of time synchronized their arrival in the United States with the imperative of inclusion of these two women in its social fabric. The trajectories of their careers in the new country took them to different places in life. So the time of their arrival, Ayn Rand arrived in the United States in 1926 and Alexander Kropotkin in 1927. The paths of Ayn Rand and Alexander Kropotkin never crossed. Ayn Rand got a referral letter to Cecil DeMille, who was one of the leading movie directors in Hollywood, and she left for Southern California, where she started working for him and trying her hand in writing scripts. So she met an actor, Frank O'Connor, married him and took his last name. While Alexander Kropotkin arrived in the United States in 1927 and was welcomed by the press, by the New York Times, hailed as Russian princess who comes to study US, daughter of Prince Kropotkin, says she may base her lectures on her observation. She approves of Soviet system. She opposes communist rulers. That's what the readers of New York Times found in the newspaper. Adapting to a new social environment, these two people found the necessity to establish themselves, and they got both engaged in telling stories, writing stories, an activity known to mankind since times immemorial. Both women used the four levels of knowledge: sense, imagination, reason, and intellect. Their cultural heritage punctuated their works. But here we witness the dichotomy where the emotional impact of their previous experience modified their convictions and formed their new attitudes. So though Ayn Rand didn't ever collaborate or comment on Alexander Kropotkin, but she wrote a comment on her father's quote. Her father's quote, "Social life that is we, nor I, is the normal form of life," Peter Kropotkin. To which Ayn Rand in her journals writes, "Good God Almighty, this is exactly what I'm going to fight. For the exact opposite is true. If man started as a social animal, isn't all progress and civilization directed toward making him an individual? Isn't that the only possible progress? If men are the highest animals, isn't man the next step?" She became the author of the theory of individualism and objectivism, which became popular, most popular in the United States and still is. So we also witness here the notion and the concept of ressentiment, the notion and concept developed by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is an acceptable term in philosophy and psychology for resentment and hostility directed toward an object that one identifies as the cause of one's frustration, when the ego creates an enemy and a defense mechanism in order to insulate itself from the object of this frustration. So, creating her theory of individualism and objectivism, which found reflection in her best-selling novels, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and also in all other publications and periodicals. Ayn Rand created a society of objectivists, which was followed and included very popular figures, public figures like Alan Greenspan. Here he is, young Alan Greenspan, as the future chairman of the US Federal Reserve. And in this picture, we see Ayn Rand and in the company of President Gerald Ford and the Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan at the time when he was sworn in at this position. So the theory of objectivism and individualism has become one of the most popular theories. Ayn Rand's utter opposition to the collectivism as a social structure triggered the development of her philosophy, which became the leitmotif of all her literary works. This is how she described the moral basis of individualism in her journals. Altruism is the doctrine which holds that man must live for others and place others above self. Humanity has proclaimed its moral idea unanimously, but look back at humanity's record. Every major horror of history was perpetrated, not by reason of and in the name of that which men held as evil as selfishness, but through, by, for, and in the name of an altruistic purpose. The Inquisition, religious wars, civil wars, the French Revolution, the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution. No act of selfishness has ever equaled the carnages perpetrated by the disciples of altruism. So the ideal was right, but can we say that Robespierre was the wrong man? Or Cromwell, or Lenin, or Hitler, or Stalin? Isn't it time to question that noble ideal instead? That was her philosophy. And meanwhile, Alexander Kropotkin started writing a weekly magazine, a column in a weekly magazine, Liberty, and she became one of the most popular columnists in the USA of that time. She probably learned her journalistic craft from Somerset Maugham, who once said, "I've taken an absorbing interest in human nature, and it has seemed to me that I could best communicate my observations on it by telling tales." Alexander knew that telling tales was appealing to the human nature, to the depths of its virtues and vices. Referring of Sasha to Maxim Gorky, once Bernard Shaw wrote, "A little time ago, a Russian lady, Alexander Kropotkin, brought up as extreme revolutionist, and alluding to the mission of Holy Russia, said to me with wild enthusiasm that the Russians would give the world back its lost soul." The mystique enigma of the Russian soul would be part of Sasha's aura through all her life. The soul that developed through all the three stages, coming to the highest stage, that is perfection, when she apprehended the intelligence, when she attained that state of immediate intellectual intuition, the possession of the forms of things known, that is true knowledge. She kept American readers interested and engaged for a quarter of a century, appealing to their hearts and minds by telling them stories through which she channeled her inner self. Her column was called "To the Ladies." In her articles, she would emphasize the uniqueness of the Russian national identity, manifested in simple-mindedness and innocence, obedience, and far-reaching hospitality. How did her ego and superego manifest a Russian psyche? In one of her articles in Liberty Weekly, she would write, "Years ago, an English friend asked me if all Russians were as unnecessarily truthful as I was. I certainly did my best to live up to that reputation. Whatever was stored in her subconscious gave way. She retained her dedication to the Russian people through years of living in the United States, sharing memorable stories from her past, stories about her arrest in Russia and the arrest of her friends and how she helped them to get out of jail. Carl Jung once remarked that nothing was ever lost in the psyche. Nothing was lost in her psyche either. She addressed the issues not only for the female audience, discussing fashion, psychology of the family, and the current affairs. During the Second World War, she described the American citizens who traveled to the far east of Russia, where most of the industrial enterprises had been evacuated, to teach women workers to run the machinery. She had her pulse on the Red Army fighting for the land of her forefathers. At the end of her career, she appealed to the gustatory tastes of her readers and wrote a Russian food cookbook in which she described the customs and traditions of the Russian hospitality. She was a fine polemicist and extremely experienced panelist as well. Her emotional affiliation with the Russian culture can be traced in her interview to the Longines in 1951. 1951 and also 1955. There was an American TV series sponsored by Longines, and they interviewed her. The interviewers were Mr. William Bradford Hughes, editor of the American Mercury, and Mr. Henry Hazlitt, political economist and associate editor of Newsweek magazine. The interview confirmed once again that her patriotic sentiments were always vibrant and she was never shy to express them. Ayn Rand showed her brilliance as a columnist too, writing a column in Los Angeles Times in which she commented on current events from the point of view always adversarial to the communist regime. The Ayn Rand column became her platform for disseminating the main principles of her theory of the objectivism, proving that collectivism as a social structure that lay in the base of the USSR was a doomed, futile concept. She knew how to employ ethos, pathos, and logos as the three classical modes of persuasion, not only in her essays, but also in her 2000 letters, later published as a separate edition. She used the authority of her personality and cultural background as ethos, her emotional intelligence as pathos, and her logical mind as logos. The kernels of her theory were bubbling to the minds of Americans and to their unconscious through her books and essays, as well as her public performances and interviews. Her theory never faded from zeitgeist. Its main principles have been mentioned and quoted in the light of current events in the present-day periodicals such as the Financial Times and many others. Ayn Rand's book, the first book actually, which was published in 1937, exposed the flaws of collectivism and life in the Soviet Union, where her revulsion of the social system was so intense. That book was chosen by the Italian film directors to be made into a movie in 1943, with Alida Valli playing the lead. And that movie was even approved by Mussolini and his regime, though it was made into a movie without the consent of the author and without a script. It became very popular and was used as a fascist propaganda all over Europe during the war years and after war years. In 1946, Ayn Rand filed a lawsuit against the Italian movie company, which she eventually won. Looking for patterns and crossovers in a comparative study, we came to thought-provoking conclusions. Here I'm using the Venn diagram to show the differences and the commonalities in the development of these two different, absolutely two different personalities. And just to show that a cultural heritage can sprout different branches of emotional and rational attitude toward it. Despite the domineering influence of the Russian culture in their mental outlook, impacting their character development, it was the American culture that defined their lives on the land, in the land of freedom, with an array of unexpected events, collisions, successes, and failures. The impact of cultural heritage is undeniable, but how it is expressed is largely determined by the individual's convictions, motives, and unique psychological blueprints. And here is the bibliography, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
for
much.
sharing.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you. Thank you so much. So now we are opening the floor for questions, and we already have one question for Michael from Elena Kulin. She writes that Abram Kagan's brother was a famous chess historian, Mikhail Kagan, Michael, and she wonders if the brothers had contact, if they were in any kind of contact, despite of Abram's emigration. Do you have anything to say about this? And she adds that Mikhail Kogan died during the siege of Leningrad.
Thank you. That's fascinating because I have no recollection of a brother of that name. In fact, it's not mentioned. There might be one. It's something I'd like to research. I know a little bit about Abram's father, Entin, but I do not know this connection. So it would not surprise me that there was more than one child. But my late father-in-law never mentioned him to me, and I can't see anything in the memoir. Mind you, that's possibly typical of Abram because many personal things he just skipped over. He was so obsessed with his books, he never really talked much about family. It was mostly his intellectual friends.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if we have more questions. While we're waiting for more questions, I have a question for Lada. I think it's a very interesting list of novels that you place under this concept of consular roman. But I was puzzled by this idea of transformation from homo aristocratus to the artist, and I wonder how universal this idea. For instance, Защита Luzhina seems to resist it, but in general terms, why the aristocratic origin is emphasized as the starting point for this type of the consular roman?
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much for your question. So it's actually a tricky thing to discuss. And during my other presentations, not all the people who were my audience agreed with my idea of Russian consular roman as treating the Homo aristocraticus time. But what should I say in my defense is that the émigré writers wanted to show the best possible Russian, which of course included 2 centuries of Russia's development. And of course, the aristocracy was that crème de la crème part of society, the part which was developed during the 18th and 19th century. And here are the fruit of that development. So that's the initial point practically of most novels, except for Gaito Gazdanov's and Shmelyov's, probably because they were a part of Russian intelligentsia and not of Russian nobility. While all other writers, so they modeled their protagonists after themselves, and being a Russian aristocracy, which is of course a very interesting case of Nabokov's novels, because he depicts haughty aristocrats, so aristocrats who are proud of belonging to nobility. So I think that's the starting point. And there are a number of variations on that aristocratic origins of Russian consular protagonists. And perhaps for me, the most telling is the way Ivan Bunin deals with it, because actually he problematizes the aristocratic origins of Arseniev and even of his brother, who is depicted as a socialist. And he poses a question: who is responsible for Russia's suicide? And of course, the whole family of Arseniev are responsible. So the brother of the main protagonist being a socialist, so he is of course responsible, but also the protagonist's father, who gives away practically all the fortune of his own and of his children. So he is also responsible. So I think it's also the Kunst Roman is also an arena to pose such drastic questions about how the nobility, the gentry, were connected to the destiny of Russia. So did I answer your question?
I'm saying something with the muted mic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lola. Do we have any other questions? Carly, do we have questions on the YouTube?
There's no YouTube stream, so any questions would be on Zoom.
Okay, all right.
Probably, just comments. I would like to thank all participants for this wonderful and sophisticated papers. So I'm glad that you meet each other. And I think that the main idea of all these presentations belong to the problem of freedom. Freedom as an inner human being problems. And the question of freedom is especially important for immigration as an experience of freedom and free will. And we analyzed this problem from religion aspects to the social aspects, and we see that this question still is the main question of our existence in our countries. And I would like to say special thanks to Mikhail, because the figure of Abram Kagan is very important for the history, not only pre-revolutionary Russian or Russian in exile, but especially for the world publishing world. And unfortunately, the name of Kagan, as many names of immigrants, was forgotten. And I hope that all these papers will be the new start for researchers with new theme, because it's very important to understand that the theme of immigration, the apology of immigration, is not the only topic of for immigrants, but for the whole entire world, because we start to think about intertextuality of culture. and philosophical and religion aspect, spiritual aspect of our human being. And I think it's our goal, and this is the most important thing in our life. Thank you, Mark, for you.
Thank you, Marina. We have a question from Michael.
Can I make a comment?
No. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I just echo what we've just heard. I have a lot of letters that are in Russian and I can't translate them. Correspondence between Abram and Anatol. And similarly to the memoir, there's a lot of information, a lot of fine detail that I don't understand. And hopefully I might be able to find a collaborator, at least to look at the material, which I would like to deposit in the Bakhmetiv archive. I believe there's quite a few volumes there of Abram. But I should just say a quick word, please, about Anatol himself, who he chose not to go to the US. He went to England and then he came to Australia. He wanted to get a long way away. He remained an ardent Trotskyist throughout his life, totally opposed to his father. His father wanted him to be an artist. Abram knew Chagall. But Anatol said, no, I want to be something of the ground. He became a very well-known modernist architect in Sydney and Melbourne. But once he'd retired, there was a project he spent 25 years on. He continued to build, to create a landscape in St. Petersburg, a polder onto the Bay of Finland with a beautiful area for great architects of the world and believers in social equality to come build, and there were beautiful monuments, museums. He would borrow maps, beg, borrow and steal, and his plan was to go to Russia, which he did eventually. And there were plans. Unfortunately, nothing was ever heard about them. Nothing came out of perestroika. But I mention this not as tragic, but to say how these émigré people and their children continued to believe and wish to share the greatness of that part of the world that we call Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much. So, if we don't have any more questions and comments, and our audience doesn't have it, thank you everyone for the participation. Thank you for being here, and let's meet again and talk about this and similar issues in a while. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Big thanks to the organizers, to the administrators. Big thanks.
Thank you.